Welcome to the 8th Annual Loft Film Fest. I'm Peggy Johnson. I'm the executive director of this nonprofit art cinema that puts on this festival every year. And I really want to thank you for being here for this very special night with Noam Chomsky. This is kind of like a dream come true for a lot of us, so I'm sure that's why you're here too. I want to start out by thanking our title sponsor, Desert Diamond Casinos and Entertainment. They've been loyal sponsors for years, and without their financial support, this wouldn't be happening, so I really want to thank them. We also got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts this year for this festival, which is a big deal. They only gave 66 grants in total for film-related things, and very few of them were for just general film festivals. So we're in pretty good company there. And we just found out this week that they gave us a grant for next year, too. So very excited about that. I also really want to thank one of our major partners, which is the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. They support us, have supported us for a long time financially, but more importantly really is with their partnership in so many different things that we do, from journalism on screen on, and this, I don't want to even start. But for tonight, they're a very special partner because they arranged for Professor Chomsky to be here tonight. So J.P. Jones is in the back, the dean, and I really want to thank him and everybody at SBS for their incredible support. We love SBS. Our presenting sponsors are the Arizona Inn, Buffalo Exchange, the Geico office, which is located next door, Tucson Lifestyle, and Zocalo, which printed our beautiful programs. We really want to thank them. And I really want to take just a minute to thank the staff who works in this festival, because I think they're extraordinary. And the programming, the quality of the films, and the representation that it contains, and everything about the program is so thoroughly well thought out, and I'm so proud. J.J. Giddings and Jeff Yance are the co-directors, and they've been great leaders for programming this really great fest. So I'm proud of them and everybody who works at the Loft, including everybody at the theater and the people that sell your popcorn and your tickets and the projectionists and everybody. I also really want to thank our volunteers who are amazing, 100 plus. Our board of directors, several of whom are here, and of course our loyal Loft members. We thank you so much. We have about 7,000 now, so pretty good. Quickly, we're doing a drawing for 2 passes to next year's film festival, so there's a place in the lobby you can fill out a form. And next year is going to be great. One of the things we're going to be doing is going solar. So this entire building will be powered by solar. And it will include covered parking. So there'll be those 2 things to look for. If during the film you'd be careful to be sure all your devices are silent and your screens don't light up, we'd appreciate it. And if you take your stuff with you when you leave, that'd be great and make it easier on the staff. And that's all the housekeeping. Now, I want to introduce the co-director of the festival, and when he's not doing that, the program director, Jeff Yance, who will be presenting Professor Chomsky with the Lofty Achievement Award. Jeff?
Thank you, Peggy. So, welcome everyone. Needless to say, we are very excited. This is an example of why I love working here at the Loft Cinema. 2 nights ago, we kicked off the festival with an event built around the film Revenge of the Nerds, which was shot here in Tucson, and we had Curtis Armstrong, the actor who plays Booger, here as our guest. And then tonight, we have an entirely different kind of guest. It's everything all under one roof, and I love it. So tonight, we are honored, we're excited, and just thrilled to have the world-renowned author, activist, intellectual, and movie star, Noam Chomsky, with us. Yep. So, in addition to being the founder of modern linguistics and one of the most well-recognized public intellectuals on the planet, I like to think of him as an intellectual rock star. We don't have a lot of those. And having appeared in over 25 films, he is now also officially a Tucsonan, which I think is great. So now we've got some really cool people living here. So he, of course, joined the University of Arizona faculty this fall as a laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. He also holds the title of Agnes Helms-Haury Chair, sponsored by the Agnes Helms-Haury Program in Environmental and Social Justice at the U of A. And now he's here at the Loft Cinema, and I can't wait. So would you please give a warm Tucson welcome to our newest Tucsonan, Noam Chomski. Noam, just before we start having a little discussion here, I just wanted to present you with this. We'll give you a bag to carry this home. I'm sure out of all the awards you've won in your career, this is the one that you were waiting for. In honor of your contributions to cinema, which is why you're here tonight, and of course, I think your tireless and really inspiring efforts to make the world a better place, and for just being Noam Chomsky, we would like to dedicate and give you the Lofty Achievement Award for 2017 to Noam Chomsky. You know, let's take a picture. You got it? You don't actually have to hold it. We'll put it right here.
Thank you very much. We have set aside a place in our new house exactly for that.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Professor Chomsky. That's great. So we're here tonight, Professor Chomsky, to celebrate the 25th anniversary of manufacturing consent, which, of course, is based on your book from 1988, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, which we have copies of this available in the lobby. I can't imagine anyone doesn't already own this, but just in case, you should get a copy. And then the film, of course, came out in 1992. This is, I think, just one of the most important, relevant political documentaries ever made. And I think anyone who feels like fake news is a modern phenomenon needs to watch this film. So could you talk a little bit about how the book evolved into the film?
I can't really say very much about that because I was involved in the film about in the way that the moon is involved in a photograph of the moon. I had interviews and discussions with the producers, and they welded it together and turned it into a film, which, to tell you the truth, I've never actually seen. I can't stand looking at myself or hearing myself.
Oh, well then you would hate this film because it's all you, the whole film. Well, it's a very good film, just so you know.
They're very talented producers.
Yeah, so it's Mark Achbar and Peter Wintonick. Yeah, really just a great film. So this movie is so, as I mentioned, so incredibly relevant today, 25 years on. Could you talk a little bit about, I guess, the book, since you haven't seen the film?
I have seen the book.
Yes. So could you talk a little bit about how the ideas, the thesis of the book is relevant to us today in 2017?
Well, actually, my co-author, Ed Herman, and I had worked together for many years. Actually, our first book is perhaps relevant to the film, and the actual book was about 1971, I think, and it had an interesting history. The book was published by a very rather successful publishing company that was producing materials mainly for universities. And the company happened to be a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, now part of Time Warner, pretty soon probably part of something bigger. And one of the executives of Warner Brothers saw some publicity for the book and didn't like the fact it was called Counter-Revolutionary Violence. And you can guess what the topic was. He didn't like it much, so he asked for a copy of the book, and when he looked at it, he was appalled. And he ordered the publisher to withdraw all copies of it. And when they refused, he simply put the publisher out of business, literally. Kind of interestingly, there was not much reaction to this. It was considered legitimate because it's not an infringement on freedom of speech. The people who speak up for freedom of speech, Nat Hentaf, ACLU, didn't see any problem. It's private enterprise, and of course, private enterprise is entitled to do whatever it likes. Well, that's actually relevant to the book, because one of the, Ed, my co-author, is a professor of finance at the Wharton School. His main professional field is corporate power, corporate control. I've written some of the main books on that. And the two of us decided to try to do an analysis of the factors that enter into choice and framing of news in the major media. So we, neither of us watched television much, so we kept print media, New York Times, Washington Post, the major media, CBS, a few others. There was no CNN in those days. One of the factors that we think enters into determination of the framing, structure, choice of news is simply ownership. These are corporations which are in business. Their business is to sell a product to a market, like any corporation. The product they sell is you, and they sell it to advertisers, to other big corporations. So what you have is a system structurally which is one of major corporations, in fact parts of mega corporations, selling people to other major corporations. That already suggests what you might anticipate the character of the product would be. It would meet the needs and demands of the sellers and the buyers. And we then considered several other factors that relate to this same issue, the very close interaction between the corporate system and state power, which is extremely intimate. So there's a reflection of state power and its propaganda needs and so on, and a few other things. And from that we developed a model of what one would anticipate if you say we were a Martian looking at this system. What would you anticipate the media products would be? And that's the first chapter of the book, and the rest is illustrations of how it works. And we didn't want to bias the choices, so we picked examples of which the media were most proud, the things that they thought were their major successes, and tried to show you can look and see if you think the demonstration is successful, that we tried to show that, in fact, the predictions of the model, which are quite simple, it's basically a kind of a guided free market model of the kind that economists take for granted. See if these actually work out. We have also done the same thing in quite a few other cases. Several books on Political Economy of Human Rights, several volumes in which we again studied media analysis of different situations and sought to show that we asked whether and sought to show that in fact it conformed to the same natural expectations. Incidentally, this is not really a critique of the media, so it's nothing like the fake news business. In fact, in this book, Manufacturing Consent, the last part of the book, maybe about a third, is actually defense of the media from criticism by the liberal monitors, Freedom House, who launched a major assault against the media, a couple of huge volumes that they published, trying to show that the media were unpatriotic and were responsible for losing the Vietnam War. So what we did was go through probably the only people ever. It was a lot of publicity for this, Freedom House, big institution. The author was a famous journalist, Peter Braystrup. But I suspect that we were the only people to actually take a look at the two volumes. The first volume was the charges against the media. The second volume was the documentation. And when you go through the documentation, you find it completely refutes the charges. In fact, so it's a kind of defense of the media, but journalists hated it. It was first published in an article in a journalism review, and journalists were very upset by it, and they didn't like the whole idea. And the reason was, what we pointed out was that, contrary to the criticism, the journalists, the correspondents, especially the foreign correspondents, were doing a very honest, serious, courageous job. They deserved a lot of respect for what they were discovering and producing. However, they were doing it within an ideological framework, which was highly supportive of state power and ideology. Actually, it's not so different from the Ken Burns film that just came out. The idea was the war began with, as Anthony Lewis put it from the left, began with blundering efforts to do good. We were desperately trying to bring democracy and freedom to the poor Vietnamese, and unfortunately we failed, so it turned out that we had to withdraw without succeeding in our wonderful aims. That was the framework. And within that framework, they did an honest job of describing what was going on. And they hated it, because what they want to be perceived as courageous crusaders opposing power and ideology, not as serious, honest professionals doing the job, their own job, within an unquestioned framework of subordination to ideology. Of course, the war never started with blundering efforts to do good. It started with quite purposeful and understanding efforts to prevent independence and freedom for a former French colony where the U.S. took over the imperial role. And in fact, the truth of the matter is it wasn't a lost war. The U.S. succeeded in its major objectives. Ed Herman and I are maybe almost alone in arguing this, but I think it's correct. If you look back at the original objectives, we have now a ton of internal documents that have come out, Pentagon Papers and others. It was pretty much what you'd expect. It's the normal imperial commitment. Was put pretty well by Henry Kissinger. Not my favorite person, but he says some things quite accurately. What he pointed out is that a leading principle of policy must be to detect viruses that might spread contagion and destroy the virus and prevent contagion from spreading. The virus is independent nationalism that might succeed, and the contagion is others might be in similar situations, might be tempted to follow it. So what do you do when you have a virus that's going to spread contagion? You destroy the virus, you inoculate the potential victims. The way to do it is by instituting vicious and brutal dictatorships which will repress any threat that the thought of successful independence might spread. And the U.S. did that very successfully. Indochina was destroyed, not a model for anyone, not going to spread anything. The surrounding region, the U.S. succeeded in installing murderous dictatorships in every relevant country, Thailand, Philippines. The great success was Indonesia. That was considered the major concern. Vietnam itself, nobody cared much about, but Indonesia had rich resources. And in 1965, a magnificent event took place. There was a military coup supported, backed by the United States, helped implement it, which carried out what the New York Times called a staggering mass slaughter. Time magazine devoted an entire issue to the boiling bloodbath, which was praised because if you read the main liberal columnist of the New York Times, James Reston, he called it a gleam of light in Asia. And the editors of the Times praised the U.S. government for keeping its own role in implementing the staggering mass slaughter quiet, not making it public, so that the Indonesian moderates, as they called them, who carried out this great achievement, would be able to get full credit for it without having to any indication that they were really just being helped and manipulated by the United States. That was the general reaction at the time. It's quite interesting that just recently, you may have seen, government archives were released, some government archives, on the U.S. role in the Indonesian massacre. And it was reported in the press, not pretty adequately, with one crucial exception. They didn't mention the fact that they knew all the time, right at the beginning, that the U.S. government was directly involved, and they praised it. They thought it was wonderful, because this ended the threat that the contagion might spread. In fact, McGeorge Bundy, who was National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, later, in retrospect, argued that the Vietnam War should probably have been ended in 1965, when this massacre took place, because by then the goals had been achieved. That's the story. It's not the story you get in the media. It's not the story you get in Ken Burns' documentary. So the picture is that the journalists on the scene are serious, honest, courageous professionals, working hard, taking real chances, discovering all sorts of things, giving us very valuable news, not fake news, but doing it within a framework of ideological subordination, which is quite extraordinary. And we tried to show that in case after case. So it's not really a critique of the media. It's an analysis of how a society that is permeated with intensive propaganda internalizes and perceives the events of the world. And incidentally, the United States is rather different in the way it perceives these things from other countries. So one thing that you haven't read in the American press is that there are international polls taken by the leading U.S. polling agencies, Gallup polls, which ask all sorts of questions about international opinion. And one of the questions they ask is, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? Guess what the answer is? In fact, nobody else is even close. Way behind in second place was Pakistan, and that was inflated by the Indian vote. And the countries that we call the major threat to world peace, like Iran, were barely even mentioned. But that's just the world, and there's no reason why people here shouldn't know anything about that. So that's not the kind of news that's fit to print. Just like the reasons for the invasion of Vietnam and the basic success in achieving the fundamental goals. But I think that's what we investigated in a pretty wide range of cases.
Well, it's interesting reading reviews of the book from the time. The word conspiracy theorist was thrown around a lot. When to me it seemed like a very fair and balanced look. So how did you and how do you respond to those kind of critiques?
Well, I would ask, suppose that General Motors is trying to make a profit next year. And they make plans, and they decide what to produce, and they produce advertisements and so on. Is that a conspiracy? I mean, that's the normal workings of a player in a state capitalist system. That's exactly what we're seeing the media on. The same kind of conspiracy as General Motors when they try to make profit.
Now, the book and the movie came out pre-internet era, certainly, and you've written and talked a lot about the internet, but could you just talk a little bit about social media and how it relates to the ideas in manufacturing consent? I mean, it feels like we're at an unprecedented time where we have perceived access between the higher and the lower through social media. The idea that our president would engage in a Twitter war with a teenager from Des Moines seems unthinkable 5 years ago.
Actually, it's very thinkable.
Yeah.
For those of you who are old enough may remember the first George Bush, his campaign. His vice presidential candidate was Dan Quayle. And many of you may remember this, in the middle of the campaign, there was a sitcom that was being shown called, I don't know what it was called, it was about some woman named Murphy Brown.
Yes.
And Murphy Brown in the sitcom made some comment critical of Bush and Quayle. And Quayle responded to her. And then the producers figured, okay, this is great, we can exploit this. So they rewrote the series so that Murphy Brown then responded to Dan Quayle, and he picked it up and responded to her, and there was a big battle going on between Dan, the vice presidential candidate, and a sitcom character. I happened to be in Europe at the time, and people couldn't believe it. You know? So it's not all that new.
It's not a new phenomenon, yeah. So does social media give us more access to those in power, or is that just an illusion, do you think?
Social media has, first of all, internet does provide us with, in principle, access to many different sources of news and information. So you can, for example, read, say, correspondence in the Middle East to publish in the London Independent. You can read what the Iranian press, how they interpret the events of the world. You can you can pick up the Russian press and Russian media. You can see what they think about things. So there is a diversification of information, but it doesn't fundamentally change the basic sources that we have. The social media provide valuable means for people to present their opinions, to interact with others, to debate, have controversial discussions, and it sometimes is very healthy and productive. But there's a negative side, which has been well discussed, that tends to create what are called, bubbles in which people basically go to a range of media which reinforce their own views. And in fact, that is a major source of conspiracy theories that explode and develop. You may have noticed today, I think, in the press, there was a report of the reaction to the massacre in the church, and immediately before anything was discovered, the social media were putting out material saying that it was a Muslim who was working for ISIS. When it turned out that he was a white man who lived in a near community, they changed the idea. They changed it to he was a recent convert to Islam, and this was seen. These things were put out and repeated, and you get them. Somebody else repeats them, and they reach a huge number of people. And these are often people who just don't look at anything else. In fact, there was a startling poll taken recently by one of the leading polling agencies, I think it may have been Pew, who asked Republicans alone, not Trump supporters, Republicans, what news source did they trust most? Of course, the mainstream media were way down at the bottom. Fox News was a little higher, but the one they trusted completely was Trump. So anything he says has got to be true, and if it's even if Fox News doesn't accept it, that means they just don't know what they're doing, and that's the kind of extreme sort of consequence that can follow from the creation of self-reinforcing bubbles. And people on the left are not immune to that either. You tend to go to your own sources and you don't hear other opinions. So I think it's got a positive side. It's been, all of us use it and should, in fact, but there are downsides as well. However, as far as the structural analysis given in the book, what we call the propaganda model, I don't think it affects it at all. We have the same major sources of news and information. They're pretty much subject, I think, to the same constraints and conditions, which are just part of the nature of the institutions.
Do you think that an ongoing issue is the issue we have with media literacy in the United States in terms of teaching children from a very early age who are saturated with media right out of the womb, practically, how to be critical thinkers about what they're seeing and reading and consuming?
Well, I don't think it's so much, I think it's media illiteracy. Younger people just aren't reading. The level, the amount of I can remember as a child, first of all, in those days, back in the 1930s, the newspapers came twice a day. You read the morning newspaper, you read the evening newspaper. They came from different attitudes and opinions. People discussed it. Working people were immersed in media. You go back further, they had their own media. There was a range of opinions. This was just part of life, was to be immersed in media, political discussion, analysis, and so on. That's pretty much disappeared. I think, forget the exact figures, but a very high percentage of young people get their news from Facebook, not from the media, and that's serious.
Yeah, it's really frightening. You had a great anecdote last night at the Centennial Hall discussion where you talked about researching fascism when you were in the 4th grade. Which was great. So you were obviously a child who was interested in the world around him, and maybe that's part of it, getting children interested in what's happening.
I think children are naturally interested in what's happening, but you have to make sure not to stifle and suppress that interest. I think that's the real threat. There's no need to encourage curiosity among children. Anybody who's had any experience with children know that they're infinitely curious. They are asking questions all the time, want to know things, want to understand things. And unfortunately, a good part of the cultural and educational system is geared to restraining and controlling and suppressing those natural impulses. And they should be stimulated. So being interested in the rise of fascism in 1939, 1938 was not all that surprising.
as a fourth grader, it just kind of blew my mind. So we're already kind of having to wind this down, but because we're in a cinema and we're giving you the Lofty Achievement Award, I just wanted to ask you a little something about movies. I've seen you here a couple of times just watching movies at the Loft, so I feel like maybe you're a fan of film.
Well, my wife and I very much like to watch films when we have time, but the problem is finding the time. So we're hoping to become regular attenders at the Loft, so you'll see us around.
I would love it. I would love it. And are you able to just relax and watch a film for entertainment?
Oh,
or are you
sure.
always thinking about how the ideology is being constructed through the narrative?
Anything but. In fact, my wife has introduced me into cinema genres that I didn't know about before, which are a lot of fun.
And so my final question is, do you have a favorite movie?
Well, there's one movie that I did sit through twice. Couldn't. City Lights, Charlie Chaplin, City Lights.
Yes.
And I've watched it again since. I thought that was...
It's one of the greatest closing shots of a film ever.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. If anyone's seen it, they know. And did you see Captain Fantastic by any chance?
Actually, we haven't seen that.
Oh.
We came close. We had plans to do it, but actually, Tom Bever will understand this. We met a close friend of all of us, Charley, and we were going to go out to see the film, but we just got involved in a discussion and never went.
For those of you who haven't seen it, the characters celebrate Noam Chomsky Day instead of Christmas. And it's great. It was very inspiring, which we should all do. Celebrate Noam Chomsky Day. Thank you, Noam Chomsky. Thank you, everyone, for coming.